Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Deborah Reeves, the Coordinator of the Library's Research Services. Firstly, on behalf of the Parliament of Victoria and its members, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today. We pay our respects to them, their culture, their elders past and present, and we also pay our respects to people from First Nations communities who may be joining us. I welcome you to our seminar about plant-based protein research in Victoria. We're really pleased to present this event jointly with FTSE, the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. Our moderator today is Professor Sandra Kentish, who is recent chair, there's been a change, of the FTSE Victorian Division Committee and is also a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor at the University of Melbourne. When we get to questions a little later, we have a second microphone available, so please wait for that to arrive in your hand before you speak. I'll hand over to you now, Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and welcome everyone to this second joint FTSE Victorian Parliamentary Library briefing for 2020-26. And as Deborah alluded to, our topic today is plant-based protein research. This is addressing challenges from the agriculture, health sciences, biotechnology and food innovation sectors. We're undertaking innovative research in creating highly nutritious new ingredients and foods for the growing domestic population and for export, improving the pest and climate resilience of plants, advancing medicinal agriculture and developing sustainable plants and plant-derived products for both terrestrial and space applications. And we have two eminent speakers here today who'll address the collaborative national and international research efforts that are underway to innovate and translate plant-based research into new, resilient and nutritious food products, new jobs and new opportunities across the sector. I'll introduce both speakers. So our first speaker is Professor Tony Bacic. Tony is an Emeritus Professor at La Trobe University, where he was the inaugural Director of the La Trobe Institute for Sustainable Agriculture and Food, and also the Australian Research Council Research Hub for Protected Cropping. He's internationally recognised as a leader in plant biotechnology and the application of functional genomics to understand how genes and proteins interact to determine a plant's physical traits. His research is focused on the structure, function and biosynthesis of plant cell walls and the application in biotechnology and medicinal agriculture. Tony is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science and a board member of the Gene Technology Access Centre. Our second speaker is Professor Sally Gras, who is also a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor at the University of Melbourne, where she leads the agri-food and biopharma research theme in the Faculty of Engineering and Information Technology. She holds Director or Deputy Director positions in the ARC Digital Bioprocess Development Hub, the ARC Centre of Excellence in Plants for Space, and the Bio21 Molecular Science and Technology Institute. She's internationally regarded across academia, the engineering profession and wider industry through her research spanning nano to large-scale bioengineering, digital process innovation and food manufacturing. And Sally is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. So both speakers will give a presentation and then, as Deborah alluded to, we'll then have time for Q&A. So I'm going to hand over to Tony to give his presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to highlight and showcase a very small part of the high-quality plant-based research that's going on in Victoria. I'd like to put it in the global context and the global challenge that we face, and then really relate that to the opportunity that exists for Victoria to move forward, because it's going to take a whole rethink of the food system in Australia. So I think many of you will be aware of the global challenge that exists. There's 25% more people, which in itself has some issues, but it's not an issue from a food production system. But the real clinker there is that those 25% extra people are going to need 70% more calories, so 3 times the amount of calories that we need today. And this is because as we become more affluent, we eat more food. And as we go into 2050, we're going to have diminishing arable land, the climate change impacts, and it's now quite clear that food is a sovereign security risk. And I think this was highlighted during COVID, During COVID, we had 5 days of fresh food and 14 days of non-perishable food at the supermarket shelves or in our homes. So the supply chains or the on-demand supply chains really do not work, and I think we need to think about food as a sovereign security risk, and this is where agriculture comes in. But agriculture costs energy, so 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions, 75% of the water use, and regrettably we waste 30% of what we produce. So we could feed those 10 billion people now if we didn't waste the food. But that's another issue. So this is not sustainable as we go forward. And it's not sustainable for a second reason, and that is we, the plant scientists, the plant breeders, everyone has been producing food at an incredible rate. The farmers are really brilliant at what they're producing. But it's now evident that we're producing energy-rich food which is nutrient poor. And what that is doing is impacting on our health. So what we call this is a nutritional security risk. So just to give you a snapshot, in Australia, the cost of food-related non-communicable diseases to our health budget equals our agriculture output, roughly $100 billion. And it's the fastest growing aspect of our health budgets now, not just in Australia but in most nations, is that the quality of the food is impacting the health outcomes of the population. So it's really both a sovereign security risk and a nutritional security risk. So just to put this into context, Australia punches well above its weight, as we all know. We're about the 7th largest exporting country in the world on very marginal soil, so our farmers do extremely well. We're about 3% of global production. The agriculture sector is about 2% of GDP. If you include the whole food systems, it's between 10 and 15%, depending on how you do the numbers, employing 2.3 million people. And Victoria is a powerhouse in the national context. We're somewhere between 25 and 30% of the ag and food output, and we employ roughly 150,000 people with a $40 billion, depends on what you include there again. So Victoria is a key player in the nation's agri-food systems. And in fact, when we come down to Melbourne, and we're talking about research now, many of you will know that within Melbourne City itself, there was a precinct development. Parkville's the biomedical precinct, and our north there is the agri-food precinct. And it's one of the largest in Australia in terms of having 2 universities, RMIT, several TAFEs, and in fact within AgriBio, which was supported and funded during the Brax-Brumby era as a building, nearly a $300 million building, which is cohabits between AgVic Research, AgVic Services and the university. So there's a huge ecosystem, and that's where the institute that I established is housed. And we also have Northlink, which is the peak body for around 400 businesses that employs 10,000 people. And if you want to go a bit further out, there's the Epping Distribution Centre. So enormous amount of effort in R&D goes on in this precinct, and it's one of Australia's largest and most important. So let's bring this back to the plant-based protein work and put it into context. When we talk about plant-based proteins, obviously all plants have proteins, but the major and cereals and the industry in Australia, wheat, there's an important protein component of it. But as we move forward, the real area that it's going to focus on is legumes. And so legumes, of course, are really the ideal nutritional profile to eat. And because they're high in protein, they're high in fibre, and they're high in these micronutrients that we were talking about. And they have a low GI in terms of the carbohydrates that are there. The carbohydrates are good dietary fibre components, both soluble and insoluble. And their consumption increases satiety, reduces energy intake, and it's all great for us, but we don't eat them. That's the problem. And compared to other nations, our intake of the legumes is pretty low. It's about 2.9 kilograms per capita, which compared to Asia is around 9 or 10 kilograms. And so we have a low intake, and there's a number of reasons for this. One is that there's anti-nutritive factors in them. The taste, quality and cost is critical. So there's a taste element of this that people don't like, but there's also a preparation time as well. Everyone can stick their bit of rice for 10 minutes and cook it and it's gone. If you want to actually eat a lot of legume grains, you quite often have to hydrate them the night before. You have to think about how you're going to cook them. And it turns out from a consumer point of view, the nutritional profile and the health claims are of less importance than the cost. And so... Oh, it's fine on him. Sorry. Get rid of the slides, he says. Should I stop pressing them?
No, you're all right. I think it's just a HDMI cable problem.
That's good to see that the university lecturers are used to this sort of stuff. Keep talking. Okay. And the other issue, so in spite of the value of them from a health point of view, people's budgets are really stretched. So when push comes to shove, they'll go for the lower quality and the bulk. And the other element which Sally's going to address in more detail is the processing side of it. We don't have we do actually have very well developed processing ways to enhance the acceptance of and functional properties of legumes, but we don't have them actually in Australia, and that's the problem, and we'll come to that later. And one of the things I was going to say is that in terms of when we'll see the slides is Victoria is a powerhouse when it comes to production of legumes. So we produce half of Australia's lentils and about a third of Australia's faba bean. And these are critically important in this sort of nutritional debate that we're having because they're high in protein, they're high in fibre and they're high in micronutrients and low in fats. So again, coming back to this ideal that they are. So you're not going to see any of these things, but by the look of it. So I just wanted to move to then saying what our institute is doing. And because of this, the driver has been, and the paradigm has always been paddock to plate. There we're going. Great. I was better not touch it. So paddock to plate, but we would argue, in fact, if you look at where we're heading from a health perspective, we need to go from gut back to paddock. And the drivers need to be health and nutritional drivers that are then informing the food processing industry, that are also informing agricultural production systems. And I'll come back to why that isn't the case. So we've got major programs in broadacre agriculture, so lots of work in legumes, and Victoria is very strong in the agronomy and the genetics of legumes. And the other area that we've actually developed and has been supported by state government in the infrastructure grants is to set up a very significant investment in protected cropping, so $20-odd million in glasshouses, including existing infrastructure and glasshouses we had already, and an ARC, Industrial Transformation Research Hub Protected Cropping Centre. This is one of two. The first one was on medicinal agriculture, and now it includes medicinal agriculture and horticulture. And the reasons we've been investing in that space, and we'll talk about this, is because the drivers in protected cropping are different to broadacre agriculture drivers, and we can address this. But just to put it in context, the Netherlands, which is a landmass only a fraction of Tasmania, are the second biggest exporters of horticultural products in the world. And they do it primarily in protected cropping environments. Whereas in Australia, where there's huge benefits for protected cropping, we have 14% of our horticultural crops are in protected cropping. And yet it's been demonstrated you get twice the yield, you get much better consistent quality, and you halve the inputs and reduce the water intake. And we have solar energy here. We have the energy that it takes to drive these things. So we can talk about why this is not the case. So significant challenges, a really strong research and innovation base in Victoria and our universities, but what's missing? So the challenge really, and I just want to define food security for you. This is how the World Health Organisation defines. So it's really about having equitable, affordable, accessible food for all. And the food hunger group in Australia has identified 32% of our households are experiencing food insecurity to a moderate or extreme event case. This is a 2024 report. Go. Okay. So we've got to think of the food system as a holistic system that provides both sovereign food security and nutritional security. There is a national integrated food strategy going through, $3.5 million, 2 years to get to an answer. You've got to wonder whether there's any urgency about it. We've got the wrong price levers that are driving agricultural production in Australia, and we can talk about that system. That's a food system issue. We really do need to really think about our sovereign capability across the value chain. We need regional manufacturing hubs. Agriculture is actually delivering less jobs in the regions because the pressures on agricultural production means reduced labour because technology is taking over. But if we could have manufacturing value adding to those commodities in the regions, then you're really generating skilled workforce in the region. And I've always said this, if there's a medical research future fund worth 20 billion, then the agri-food one should be worth equivalent because it really is going to impact on our health into the future. So really happy to answer any questions and thank you for listening.
Well, thanks, Tony. And I'd like to continue on the topic of plant proteins. And in particular, I want to talk about why there is so much interest in plant proteins. And what I hope to show you is how not only growing plant proteins here in Victoria, but also processing them provides us with an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase our resilience, and also to create regional jobs of the type that Tony was talking about. And we've already heard that our population is growing and it's projected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050. And plant-based proteins have the potential to reduce both land and water use, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But it depends very much on the crop we're talking about and how it's processed. And there's a regional opportunity for us to process these plant materials here in Victoria, to increase our sovereign manufacturing and to reduce the reliance on supply chains, which we know at the moment is so important in terms of food and other things in the supply chain. And these factors are balanced also by a demand in terms of, or a need in terms of health, but also consumer need and markets. And so you may have heard about the Eat Lancet diet. This was re-released last year. And you can see here a picture of the plate of what we should be eating, and it's mostly plant-based foods. And that's to balance both health, but also the planetary constraints that we have as well, that we face globally. And we know that consumers love protein in their diet. That might be you as well. And there's also a number of changes that Tony spoke to too in terms of trends of diets. And 66% of Australians are overweight or obese, and that influences their dietary intake. But also 0.5 of a million Australians are on GLP-1, that's the weight loss drug. And that impacts on their protein needs. And so they need more protein so they don't lose muscle mass. So there's a number of factors that are influencing diets and then how people are consuming those diets. And if we look to Australian supermarkets, around 12% of products already contain plant ingredients. And that includes isolates and concentrates as well. So we know that there's a market need or demand for these products. So where are then the opportunities for us to add value in Victoria? They're quite diverse. And so if we look across the products here, you can see that there's opportunities to fortify, so to add more plant protein to existing products. And this example on the left here is a juice, and it contains 2% fava bean protein isolate. Now that's protein that's grown here, I believe, in Victoria and also processed using technology that CSIRO helped to scale up. So a nice example. On the right, we have where whole product categories are being replaced by plant protein. So you might be familiar with the V2 burger. It contains around 19% soy protein. And we've got an egg replacer here that contains a small amount of pea protein. So that's another way that we can add value. But where we add value is when we're actually manufacturing those ingredients ourselves. And so in the case of soy or pea, that's highly likely to be an imported plant protein. And instead, there's opportunity for us to take some of the crops that Tony talked about and to add value to those here in Victoria. So when we talk about manufacturing, what do we mean? So there's a couple of routes for processing plant protein that you can see taking it from the left here to the right. So this includes wet fractionation and dry fractionation, and these vary in terms of the inputs that we need for these processes, so the energy, the water, the resources that go into these types of processing technologies. And you can see that they produce a number of different products, so flours, concentrates and isolates, and that the protein content is getting higher as we fractionate or purify further. And Tony talked to how we have an idea about these technologies. Some of them are established, but there are certainly many gaps in these technologies, and also room for innovation as well. And some of the technical challenges are around the taste and the texture. So how do we make things that you and I would like to eat? And how do we have the functionality as well? So that's about how the product, the ingredient, or how it behaves when it's used by manufacturers in a product. And so there's certainly a need for innovation and lots of scope there for industry-university partnerships. I'll also make note here that there's a number of byproducts too. So you can see that there are starch, fibres and oils, and these are valuable byproduct streams as well. And there are other processing technologies like fermentation that can be used here as well. If we then think about the market for where this is going to go, we've seen some products that we might recognise from the supermarket, but some of the biggest markets are around ingredients. And so you can see around $14 billion worth, and this is a global market by 2030, for ingredients alone. And then there's nutritional supplements, there's aged care homes, where again fortification is particularly important, and then there's our pets and feed for animals as well. And so CSIRO has estimated that as a national opportunity, this is between $3 to $6 billion across these categories. So I'd like to then illustrate an example of the type of research that's going on in this space to do with plant proteins with the ARC Centre of Excellence of Plants for Space. And this is a centre I'm associated with. And one of our missions here is about creating new plant-based foods and health ingredients, including complete nutrition plants. And we've brought together the universities that you see across the top here, and two of these are from Victoria, so the University of Melbourne and the Trobe University. And we're working with partners such as NASA and the Artemis mission. And what we learn when we work with partners like that and thinking about space and perhaps the International Space Station, we can bring back some of those lessons to Earth as well, and to the industry and the growers that we work with. And those lessons might be applicable in remote environments here in Australia, or it could be that we're thinking about the constraints of a system, actually trying to constrain the energy and water that we use for processing. That's similar here on Earth as it is in space. And we're looking at the plant prototypes that you see here, the processing that goes on, the products, and then the consumer perception of these products as well. And we've had some great early insights in terms of what people would like to eat, and then the various processing routes to create those products. So if we look then at where we are in Victoria, so the current status and the strategies going forward, we do have some really good examples of work that's going on here in Victoria. The first companies that I'll point to are Australian Plant Proteins. You might be familiar with their story. Asantis is another one that's processing plant proteins. But there's a real opportunity to diversify our ingredients. And so to replace those imports that I talked about, the soy, the pea, and to add value and new markets and jobs. And Tony talked to some of those plants that are suited to Victoria, and they could be plants that are already being grown or that could be grown. And Tony again talked to the different types of agriculture that we could do here in Victoria. Now there is some urgency as well, because 33 countries are already investing in this area, and it's significant investment. You can read the numbers here yourself. So in Canada, 112 million, in Denmark, 73 million, in China, over 500 million. And so the risk for us is if we don't invest, if we don't do this type of work, we continue to export our fantastic agricultural resources, and then we bring them back and somebody else has added value to them. And we miss that opportunity to add value to our local economy here. But there are challenges, of course, in terms of the processing. I talked about that, about the functionality, the taste, making it cost effective for our manufacturers as well. And then the energy, water and land use, and making sure that we can document and understand where all of that goes, both in the agricultural side of things and then in the processing side as well. And finally, the health benefits too. But I think as we're here in the Parliamentary Library, it's also important to think about policy too. And there's a lot that we can be doing at a government level in terms of stimulating that innovation that's needed in order to get that processing correct, to give the opportunities to the local industry and manufacturing. Infrastructure is a really big hurdle. That's both in terms of R&D, and certainly there's the Werribee facility at Ciro is closing down at the moment, which again, to replace that facility, it's a cost of around 50 million. So that's less infrastructure that's going to be available into the future. And talking to companies, certainly one of the hurdles that they face is around getting the capital for starting new processes. So that's an area where government can assist as well. And finally, as well, there's also procurement and training, of course, that can de-risk some of these ventures in a smaller way to kickstart these initiatives. And I'd also just draw your attention to two excellent white papers or policy papers, one from Ciro and another from Food Frontiers, that provide a lot more information on this topic too. And thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Tony. And I will just wrestle the mic out. Do we have, the floor is open for questions. Do we have any specific questions at this point for our speakers? Yeah, go for it. Yep.
Sorry, just one second. Thank you. Well, first, thank you for the presentations. That was really interesting. I might have a bit of preamble to work up to a question, but I'm curious about how you've been weighing up pros and cons around long-term sustainability, particularly thinking about energy efficiency, water use efficiency, and also bringing it back to this idea of micronutrients and the nutrition in food. And if we're growing more like legumes, but if we're then processing and going through to say, like, you go from something like a straight up flour, but then through to your concentrate, to your isolate, you're stripping away a lot of other nutrients, both macro and micro, to get to that really refined point. And that processing takes energy, which uses energy, water, and I acknowledging you spoke about that, looking for ways to make that as efficient as possible. But if we eat the more raw product, like if humans are just eating the legumes before those processing steps, that's probably the most efficient way. Plus we get the benefit of getting a whole range of nutrients in the process. So I'm just curious, how you're weighing up the benefits of taking this processing path and what we gain from that, and what the intended end, like the major intended end use is, whether it's for human consumption or livestock, and what am I trying to ask? Basically, what is the benefit to processing through to these concentrates and isolates over just consuming the crops in a more raw state?
Thank you for the question. Okay, excellent. I agree with you. I think that if we can eat more of the raw material, it's good for us. We need the fibre, we need all of those components that are present in a plant food. And that's something we should be aiming to do. But I think the reality is we also like foods other than raw, unprocessed foods. And so by processing and creating some ingredients, we can change the functionality. And so we can change what they can do. So for instance, if we go to the egg replacer, for instance, a very small amount of protein might be able to recreate the ability to emulsify and to create foams or functions that we might require or desire in food. And so it doesn't have to be the bulk of what we're eating. If we go back to that Eat Lancet diet, the bulk of it is unrefined plant proteins or plant foods. But there's also a role definitely for replacing some of the ingredients we have and the impacts that they have by some of these refined plant ingredients as well. And it might be that a small fraction of isolated plant protein could have a really big impact. I think you do need to be thinking about the obviously, as I said, the water, the land, the energy, all of that, and there's methodologies for doing that, for looking at the whole of the life cycle and assessing it. And in fact, that's part of what some of the work that needs to be done too, is to look at these technologies and how they can be optimised, and to understand how we optimise them and how they compare. But certainly, initial studies at the moment show that a lot of these plant proteins have the potential to reduce a lot of their impacts overall.
Perhaps I could just add that, so there's two levels to look at this. One is from a global level as to if we're going to have this protein because we've got a growing population. I think how we control population is a different discussion, but we're going to have that food and we eat more of it. And so the question is, how do we produce that protein? Because the demand's going to be there. Do you produce it through primarily at the moment the protein comes from animal-based sources? I mean, there's other technologies neither of us discussed, but there's also fermentation technologies for actually producing proteins too. But the other side of it is the consumer. What's very clear with the consumers is they want convenience. Everyone's stressed. Both members of the family are working in a general family. They want to get home quick and they want to cook something quickly. And so a lot of these products that we're talking about are there and demanded by the consumer rather than the raw materials. And so I think, as Sally said, you've got to look at the whole value chain, and we need more protein. As we age, in fact, we also have a higher demand for protein. So in our hospitals, in our childcare, in all these environments, it's even more critical that we get that level of protein in. So the demand isn't going to go down. The question you need to ask, I think, is at a higher level, is that where is the most sustainable, cost-effective protein going to come from? Rather than, just down at this processing level, because that processing is happening everywhere. It's also happening with the animal protein extraction processes too. So then you've got to, compare all these elements. That's all I would say.
Do we have any other? Yes, question up there. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Emma Keeley, I'm the member for Low and Shadow Minister for Agriculture. Live in Horsham, so we've got Australian Plant Proteins fractionating plant there. There's two parts that I'd like to highlight. One is that the original plant purification processing was developed at Grains Innovation Park, and the intent behind that was to take second grade legumes and other pulses to provide a market for farmers. It appears through your research or what you've shared today, you're actually looking at instead shifting farmers to grow different crops to be able to be a primary material put through a plant protein purification, processing, enough peas, cycle. Have you worked with agricultural communities to understand what the uptake would be, given this is a very new market, and to translate vast numbers of farmers to change to a different crop type is significant and may not be possible in certain areas? And then second of all, it's looking at the other end, the consumer demand, which has been highlighted by previous questioners. My understanding is that one of the benefits of plant-based protein is that for bodybuilders in particular, unlike soy-based protein, it doesn't contain estrogen, so none of those bad female hormones for those bodybuilders. And for people who've got allergies to dairy, they can have plant-based protein as a supplement as well. But it doesn't seem to have translated. They couldn't ever find that market to sell it on. So it's that commercialisation of how do we make this concept fit in the real world, from farmers providing the goods that you need, the raw product that you need, to consumers and businesses actually seeing this market and wanting to invest in it, because I'm not sure it will get up and be mainstream until both of those ends are sorted.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I'll make some comparisons here with overseas situations, because it is a whole of food system question, and it's about the drivers in the system. At the moment in Australia, the drivers are around commodity-based export products. They are not about processing and adding value. And so farmers are priced on yield, a little bit in quality when it comes to wheat in terms of protein, but there's no differentiation between proteins. Proteins is just lumped as proteins, and as you rightly pointed out, there's different proteins in that. So I think it's a whole of system issue, and a really classic, and we know Australian plant proteins nearly fell over, it's partly scale. But if you look at wide open agriculture in Western Australia, so Western Australia is a company in Western Australia. Western Australia is the biggest producer of lupins in the world, and they had a pilot facility there, and they wanted to actually add value and ingredients to so they wanted to do a processing thing. What did they do? They went and bought a processing plant in Germany. They now export their products the seed to Germany. They process it in Germany and they sell it back to us and on the world market. So this is highlighting that we're not a value-added processing value chain in Australia. We're a commodity exporting, and apart from wheat, which does have a vertical integrated chain, we don't do it otherwise. The other point that I'd make is the Canadians, which Sally mentioned to you, that massive investment they made, which depends on how it's even bigger actually, but what they've done is they've actually invested 70% of that driver as a nation into the processing side, not onto the agriculture side, not the agronomy or the genetics. There was 30%. We spent 80% on the agronomy and genetics, virtually nothing on the processing side. And what they did is that they integrated all their policy, and they said, we want to be a number one protein exporter. So you can do both. AgVic Services and us at Trobe did a Acel Allen's consultancy, and they said if we got 3 or 4 factors right and coordinated, if we diverted 10% of the current protein pulse production, the legume production, which we do already, but mostly goes to animal feed or low cost, and it doesn't matter for the processing side because it's graded in a different way, we could add $100 million to the value of that crop within 10 years if we put all these steps into place. But it's going to require investment in infrastructure, in R&D, and more post-farm gate than pre-farm gate. And as you say, we've got to bring the consumer along with us, and that's the nutritional debate, which is a challenging one and a costs issue.
I'd also add to that, with the Canadian example, the thing I found really interesting about it was all of this investment also led to much greater demand for the farmers' produce. And so it's actually stimulated the pea production and change of crops as well. And some of those other examples I talked to, so Denmark, for instance, part of their investment is also around public education. So they've taken a different way to stimulate the market demand as well. And I think if we think about here in Victoria, it will be partly domestic consumption, but also there's so many export opportunities once we add value to these products or ingredients as well. And we're strategically really well positioned in terms of the market, and a lot of the market is going to be in Asia. And so that's where the plant protein demand will come from. And so we're well positioned for that export market as well.
So the other example, which we haven't heard of, is in Sweden with Redmond, and I don't know if you've heard of them, but very small country. How do they compete within the European Union in that market? So the growers got together. It was originally a growers group, and now they're not just a growers group. They own machinery, they own supermarkets, and they develop products. So they've actually, it was a combination with government, industry, and growers all got together and said, how are we going to remain viable and how are we going to be able to export? And so Redmond is a really fantastic example where you see a cooperative effort, but it's actually got to be driven by government as well in policy, and the pricing has to be right. I have many discussions with your farming friends up in the Horsham area. I know a number of them and they're very advocate, but they just say, well, give us the money. They've got to chase the money, and the inputs are increasing. I get it. So government, but if you think that it costs our health budget the same amount as what we're producing as a nation, we have to tackle this issue because it's also impacting our lives. As Sally said, what was it, 60% of us we experience malnutrition. It's overeating, it's obesity. And that's growing, and that's where, when I told you those numbers, about 25% increase, but 70% more calories, it's because we eat more as we get more affluent.
I'm just going to see if there's, while we're transferring the microphone, perhaps Tony, you could touch briefly, talk about protective cropping. Can you just explain briefly what you mean by protective cropping?
Yeah, okay, I'll do that. There's a couple of missed opportunities again there for Australia in protected cropping, I think. And one of them is in medicinal agriculture, where Victoria led the push to get a medicinal cannabis industry, which is done primarily in a protected cropping, highly regulated environment. We were the first off. AgVic drove that, the Victorian government drove that. And for all the reasons that we're the best, we're now actually allowing dumping to occur from external. There's a whole policy section there, making our local growers non-competitive. And I think this myth that agriculture is not subsidised globally, and I know we're signatories to all these non-tariff things, except Trump doesn't believe any of them, but apart from that, take Trump out of the equation, how is it possible that Canada can export processed food to us cheaper than we can produce it ourselves? So that's me. So the other protected cropping example, and this is where we're commodity focused, is around horticulture. And only 14% of Australia's horticulture is protected cropping, and most of that, 80 or 90% of it, is really polytunnels or nets, not glasshouse type things that we were talking about that we're going to go out to space with or in remote communities. So these are ways of actually really reducing your inputs, which is critical, as you have just highlighted in agriculture. And the inputs that you can impact are labour, fertilisers, chemicals, fuels, energy. So at the moment, the only one that a lot of farmers can produce is labour, reduced costs, and the technology. We had Driscoll's come to us to give us a seminar, and what did they want to know? The primary thing was nothing about the processing, the storage, the quality, all this. It was what robotics can we produce to reduce their labour costs, because that's their biggest labour cost. So I think protected cropping offers this. We have solar energy here. Not everything can go into protected cropping, don't get me wrong. But if the Netherlands can become the second biggest exporter of horticultural products in the world, why is it that we cannot? We primarily use it internally. We've got very small export of horticultural products, yet we're sitting at the doorstep to Asia, which is the fastest growing economy and actually the most affluent economy. And why are we not producing these products, even flying them? They'll pay for them. They'll pay for premium quality. So we do have markets. If we actually go to move away from this commodity thing to more actually thinking about adding value to things and selling our clean, green, machine as we are, and I think we are. But another example is in the open. It's not protected cropping.
Sorry, we're not going to have time for another example, Tony. We've got one more burning question. Otherwise, I'm going to give Sally the chance to finish up. And the question I might put to Sally is, if we were to build a regional food processing type of hub, what would be the product that you would choose to produce, and what would be the skills that might be required out of the regional workforce?
Okay, so if we're going to put in a regional hub, I think it's critical that that hub look across the entire supply chain. And we've heard about how it's really important from the initial crops that we're growing right through to the products, and then really out into export and thinking about the marketing of our products both within Australia and internationally. In terms of the product range, I think we have to be thinking about what's good to grow here in Victoria, either what's existing or what could be grown in a range of these different types of agricultural systems that we've talked to. And so it includes things like the lentil and fava bean as examples. And then I think we need to be looking strategically at what products are needed by the market, not just about protein in general, but protein quality and the functionality, and where there's a need for those different types of products. In terms of skills, again, I think it's going to be very broad. And so that's where the opportunity lies, not only in the agricultural sector, but also in terms of the supply chain. We're going to need food scientists, engineers, the plant breeders, all of the above, and of course politicians as part of that too.
We had better finish there so we don't get caught by the bells. So can I thank both our speakers for their presentations? I think they did an excellent job. Just to let you know as well that they're happy both to hang around now for a few minutes, but also you can follow up through Deborah and the Parliamentary Library if you would like more information. To thank our hosts, Deborah Reeves and Annie Wright at the back. To say that our next seminar will be on the 27th of August, and otherwise, thank you for your time. Thank you.